I have a now retired law partner who was a Marine captain before he went to law school.
Okay.
And he jokingly told me about the first Marine rule of hole digging, which is, Marine, if you find yourself in a very, very deep hole, put the shovel down. And it's the same thing, right? Don't keep digging the hole, right? Maybe you need to quit while you still have some resources to restart your life. Be thoughtful to going in. I love the idea of entrepreneurs who invest their life savings and make a go of something, right? And we all hear about people that didn't succeed at something till it was their third or fifth business try. I certainly admire people that have that kind of gumption and stick-it-to-itness. But you have to have the resources and the willingness to do that and to do that to your family. And if you're starting a business that's a franchise, consider maybe you shouldn't invest every single penny you have in it. Maybe you should invest a reasonable sum based on your resources. So just be mindful of those things going
There it
on
is.
so you don't find yourself at the bottom of the really deep hole still digging.
Yo, this is the Streetwise Podcast, where we help you level up your game, level up your leadership, and level up your life. I'm your host, Matthew McReynolds. I'm a multi-brand franchisee, and I'm a franchise consultant, which means I help people find, launch, and build their ideal franchise business. My main goal is to help you get off of zero and become the person that your dreams need you to be. Buckle up, get your popcorn ready, let's go. All right, Streetwise Nation, we have Michael Rosenthal with us today, attorney that, I'm just gonna be honest. This whole legal stuff, I am not an expert in. So I'm going to let you, Mr. Michael, introduce yourself and tell the audience what it is that you do and really what your main focus is.
Great. So I go by Mike generally.
There we go. Okay.
And I'm an attorney practicing in the Atlanta area. My practice focus is franchise and distribution law. And that means I represent franchisors and franchisees in all aspects of their business. So on the franchisor side, we help people take a business and franchise it. We prepare the required documentation, and where appropriate, we help them file state registrations and filings. That involves creating a franchise disclosure document and a franchise agreement, and then dealing with their day-to-day needs, which are vast. Typically, that would include things like dealing with problem franchisees and defaults under the franchise agreement, answering questions regarding the legal niceties involved in the sales process, those kinds of things. And on the franchisee side, we do everything from reviewing franchise disclosure documents and franchise agreements for individuals who are thinking about buying a franchise. We help them with tough situations and problems that they may be encountering. So that could be issues with the franchisor. It could be the kinds of things that any business owner would be having to deal with. Probably the most frequent thing that we help them with, and I don't do this, but I've got partners that do, are employment law issues. So like it or not, in the modern world, if you own any business with a fair number of employees, like a restaurant would be a good example, sooner or later, you're going to have employment law questions. And frankly, you're probably going to have some employment law problems that arise from having employees. That's just the nature of things.
Very interesting. So I would naturally assume that if one represents the franchisor, it might be difficult to represent also franchisees. How do you guys navigate that space? Obviously, if you've represented a franchisor and helping them set up their FDD, their franchise disclosure document, are you then not able to represent a franchisee within that same system? How does that work?
We don't normally represent franchisees within the same system. So that would be a conflict of interest. And because franchises can be anywhere from international to national within the U.S. to fairly regional or local, I get a fair number of requests to represent franchisees who are in systems that are Southeast based that my law firm represents. So we just refer them to another lawyer to hopefully get the help that they want. But that definitely would be a conflict of interest.
Got it.
We stay away from it.
Got it. And how did you get into franchise law specifically?
That's complicated. So my first job out of law school was with the Georgia Office of the Attorney General, and I worked in what was then called the Consumer's Interest Division, so consumer protection. And Georgia doesn't have a franchise statute like some states do, but we do regulate the sale of this quirky thing called business opportunities. Business opportunities are kind of half-baked franchises, is the way I describe them. The best way to describe it is it's some kind of a business in a box that you buy, but typically does not include the right to use a brand name. So a trademark would not come with that. So I was regulating or representing the agency that regulated business opportunity sellers. And when I left the Attorney General's office and hung out a shingle, I started getting phone calls from people who said, hey, you were the guy that beat me up so badly when you work with the state. I do want to comply with the law. And I thought that if anybody would know how to help me comply with the law, you would. So I started representing people that sold business opportunities. And over time, that kind of broadened into franchises, which are sort of one half step up from business opportunities. I was a trial lawyer for a long time, of course, working at the Attorney General's office, coming out of there. And then at some point, I realized that I prefer to do more other types of work. And I was spending about a third of my time on franchise related matters anyway. And I said, I really like this and I want to keep doing it more broadly. So I frankly just stopped marketing myself as a trial lawyer and started marketing myself as a franchise lawyer. But being
Interesting.
a franchise lawyer does include some aspects of trial work. It's just that I limit it to franchise disputes. I'm not typically handling other types of business disputes. And the result is I have a happier life. So it's good.
Praise God. That's what we can all ask for. It's the only thing we can ask for. Happier life.
I have tremendous respect for people that spend their days trying cases. It's really, really stressful work. And it's also, you don't control your own schedule at all. Judges and other lawyers do. That became kind of nerve wracking. And it was, there was a point I reached 25 years ago or so where I had what I call my epiphany, that awakening where I said, wow, some judges beating me up about schedule. I don't control my own life anymore. I can't take a vacation. I can't handle other types of business work for clients because judges run my life. And most judges are great, but there were a few that were difficult to deal with on scheduling. And their view of the world is when they say jump, the lawyer has to say, how high, Your Honor?
So the time that you've been in franchising, specifically as a franchise attorney, what have you seen change in the industry as new organizations come, some organizations go, you've got emerging concepts popping up? Is there any significant shift that you've noticed just from your perspective in the industry or the space as a whole?
Yes, that's a great question. So two really massive shifts. First of all, it used to be that most brands were standalone concepts and whether they were privately owned or whether they were publicly owned, meaning they were traded on a stock exchange, you had a brand that was a standalone. So McDonald's was McDonald's and Subway was Subway. And that has now morphed where so many of the brands, including massive brands like Subway, are now owned as part of a conglomerate of some sort. So you have big, big companies that own multiple brands, usually in the same line of business. So restaurant or home service,
Sure.
auto and truck service, those kinds of things. So that's one big, big shift. And then kind of going along with that, but its own way, a little bit separate, is the fact that franchisors stereotypically in the past were started by an entrepreneur. It was a guy or a gal that had something that worked as an independent business owner. They tried to replicate it and successfully did that. So they had, I always say, if you had Bubba's Barbecue and then Bubba opened a second Bubba's Barbecue and a third and a fourth, at some point he would reach out to a franchise lawyer and maybe a franchise business consultant, and he would franchise Bubba's Barbecue across his state or across the region of the country. And Bubba usually was the guy that owned it, and he's the one that at least initially interacted with the first franchisees. Typically, he owned it not just as a matter of owning the equity of the company, but he owned it and that he felt responsible for his franchisees. There was a bit of a paternalistic view, I think. And so that was sort of the very stereotypical concept of franchising for a long, long time. Private equity firms have come into the industry and they now dominate it. So that's both really good news and sometimes really bad news. Private equity firms bring a wealth of resources to franchising. So they have capital that can be used to help grow the system, to better the system. In addition to capital, they oftentimes have better trained personnel and they better understand how to create a great back office, how to support franchisees, how to do things like add menu items if it's a restaurant or services if it's a service business. So they can bring a lot of positives to it. There's a level of professionalism that they can bring to something. The bad news is I think that sometimes they lose that paternalistic view of their franchisees.
Interesting.
And it's a little bit more of a hard-nosed business sometimes. Also, I'm seeing very small, but not insignificant percentage of the industry where you have smaller private equity firms that I think are coming in and they're franchising concepts that maybe aren't quite ready to be franchised. They're a little early on it, and then they're rolling them out to the public, and they're pretty hard nosed. They can be about how they do it. When I say rolling it out to the public, I'm talking about the franchisees, not the ultimate customers for these
So
businesses.
franchising a system or a type of business that's not really ready for franchisees to take and then put that into their own market across the
Yes.
country.
So using my Bubba's barbecue example,
Sure.
I live in the South, so we like barbecue.
Yeah, I like the sound of Bubba's barbecue. I
Yeah.
rock with that.
Uh, if instead of having four Bubba's restaurants, Bubba only had one, and he had a decent business. He was making money. If somebody then came to him and said, Bubba, we're going to buy the rights to franchise your business. They bought the trademark and the right to sell as franchises, Bubba's concept. And then they hadn't really tested it in other places. So it may be, again, using the barbecue example, you got all different kinds of barbecue. We have North Carolina barbecue has a different flavor to it than other types of barbecue. So maybe
Sure.
Bubba was in North Carolina. The North Carolinians love Bubba's barbecue, but it didn't taste as good to people in South Carolina or Virginia. So maybe it didn't work as well. Or maybe Bubba was successful at his one location because he located it really well. So there's a very storied restaurant here in Atlanta called The Varsity, and it is across a major interstate from the Georgia Tech campus.
Okay.
And they sell hot dogs and hamburgers and kind of old timey food, and it's done a tremendous business for many decades, and it's strategically located across the street, albeit
Sure.
busy interstate, but there's a bridge there from a major college campus, which has students, that has faculty. And then on the other side, kind of behind it, lies Midtown Atlanta, which is now this enormous business district. So it's an incredible location that they have. And that will be hard to replicate in other places. But if one were looking to buy a franchise of the Varsity, you might look at it and not understand that it's doing millions of dollars of business in part because of its location. And so the question is, can I really replicate this elsewhere? And so I think that some of these PE firms are looking at concepts and saying, what can we sell? As opposed to what will be successful if we roll this out across the country. They can sell it because it's doing really well. That one location of Bubba's is doing $2 million of revenue, and it's
Sure.
got, a profit margin of 15 or 20%, and therefore Bubba's living a nice life. And the theory is that franchisees or prospective franchisees will see this and think, well, Bubba's doing great. I can buy a Bubba's and do great too. And again, the question is has it been proven in multiple locations? Is the financial backup there to show that? And also, and there's nothing unfair or unreasonable about this, franchisors have to make money somehow. And the way they make it typically in the long run is they charge a royalty. It may be called a royalty, it may be called something else, but it's a royalty for the use of their brand and their system. And, it will range from 4 to 10% typically, depending on the type of business and some other factors. Again, using our Bubba's example, Bubba might be pulling $300,000 a year of profit out of his business based on $2 million of revenue. But if I bought a Bubba's barbecue and I had to pay him a 6% royalty, that's $120,000 that's going to Bubba or Bubba's franchising. And now my profit's going to come down from 300 to 180, which still doesn't sound
Sure.
bad. There may be some other fees that the franchisor is charging too, not usually at that level, but there'll be possibly an advertising fund fee that goes for regional and national advertising. There may be technology fees and other fees. And again, there's nothing wrong inherently with those fees. It's just that takes an operation that was highly profitable in the hands of Bubba and makes it potentially somewhat less profitable. And so those are all things that we've seen evolve and change over time. Yeah, so I would say those are the two big changes that I've seen
Those are
over
great answers, and
years.
I've seen that too. Yes, there's the royalty fees, there's usually national brand marketing fees, you've got the technology fees, and I loved how you talked about the location and the unique aspect of specific locations, whether it's a founding location or whether it's a franchisee in a certain location that's able to, based on their unique giftings or their unique location, they're able to do really, really well. And I've seen franchise candidates come into their investigation process looking at franchise opportunities, and they see the founding location and maybe one or two successful franchisees, and they think that they're going to rock it out of the gate just because other people have been successful, but they're not necessarily thinking about all those extra factors that you're talking about. FDDs are usually structured very strongly in favor of the franchisor, very strongly in favor. And there's really not much in my mind, and maybe you can correct me, room for negotiation for a franchisee to come in and make any changes at all. Either you sign it or you don't. Now, with some of these emerging concepts that might not have a lot of backbone to them, maybe they're not based off of a founder that's been in multiple locations. What I've experienced, especially after launching this platform, a lot of franchisees are starting to reach out to me talking about, well, I've signed up for a franchise that promised all these verticals, but the verticals aren't really working. And I'm working on a theory right now. I don't know if it's already been coined, reverse franchising, a concept where a franchisor will build a concept and they'll put it out there to franchisees. Franchise owners will buy into it. And then as the franchisees are building the business, the franchisor will learn and adapt the system based on what the franchisees are learning and going through during the initial process. Now, some franchisees are going to be well capitalized enough to make it through, but others are not going to. And so, my question to you is, whose responsibility is this? I mean, obviously, franchisees need to be very, very diligent in their investigation. And I think most people are not doing the investigation that they need to. But also, there seems to be a misrepresentation on some of these franchise concepts where they're making it seem a certain type of way when these internal verticals and these internal systems might not truly exist. What do we do here from this perspective when you have people starting to fall out and struggle?
So I always try to tell prospective franchisees that they're starting a business. And if I were going to start a business, just as an example, my father was a restaurateur when I was young. He really looked into it, right? And he tried to understand the business model. What were his food costs? What were his insurance costs? He operated in this restaurant in Chicago, which means, unfortunately, at the time, there were graft costs, right? He had to pay the inspectors and so on. He had to pay organized crime people not to break his windows because that's how business was done in Chicago. But he had to sit down and figure that out. And he talked to a lot of restaurant owners who were, according to Dad, very generous with their time to explain to him, hey, this is what I deal with. And then he was able to go forward. So starting a business, to me, the due diligence that you should do should be just as great as the due diligence you would do if you were buying an already existing business. If you were buying an already existing business, you, of course, in addition to wanting to see the books, want to understand the business model, you'd want to understand what some of the pitfalls were in that business and in that industry by looking into the industry. And you would want to understand the accounting behind it. Typically, you'd get your lawyer and an accountant involved in looking at the documents, understanding the economics of it. So if you're starting a franchise, you're buying a startup from a franchisor, of course, you need to read the franchise disclosure document carefully, review about 50 or 60 of these a year now. And
Okay.
I always ask clients, have you reviewed it? Uh, Half the time the people say no, and then I say you need to. Most people acknowledge that they need to, and I presume that they do. Some of them say, well, that's why I'm hiring you. And I always say to them, it's this big, long, boring document for stimulants like coffee or tea you need to read it. Sit down on a Saturday morning, make yourself a pot of coffee and read it.
Get through that document.
Yeah, you really need to understand it because This is telling you, presumably, what you need to know about the business, and you need to be making notes and asking questions. And then once you're all done with that, you've got a list of questions, hopefully, you can ask existing franchise owners about. You can ask them, how did it go? Did you get the training that you thought you'd get? Were the systems, you mentioned systems, were the systems that the franchisor said would be in place, and were they adequate and helpful? Were you required to pay the franchisor for stuff? And that could be services or products that were of fair value. So there's nothing wrong with the franchisor requiring, for example, that you buy their logoed
Sure.
cups or napkins, or that you buy even certain marketing services through them, for example. But you want to know that it's a fair price, and you need to ask a lot of questions about that. I recommend that franchisees really dig into item 7 and item 6 of the franchise disclosure document, which spell out the ongoing costs and also spell out the startup costs. So item 7 is supposed to give franchisees a range of costs broken down by category that they can expect to incur in starting the business and through the first 90 days of operations. I sign a franchise agreement. I've got a window of time typically before I have to be open, which might include finding a location if it's a retail-based or service-based business, building out that location for customers or use by my staff, and then at some point opening my doors after I've been trained. And then there's this 90-day window after that. And with rare exceptions, when you open a business, you don't expect to be making money on day one, right? There are exceptions.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. You're not going to come out the gate swinging. It takes time to ramp these things up.
Absolutely. So again, there are exceptions. Chick-fil-A is a great exception. I've
Okay.
seen Chick-fil-A's open and there are lines around the block the first day. What an amazing business. But that is an exception. And I suspect that when they open the 5th Chick-fil-A instead of the 1500th, I don't know what number they're up to, it wasn't that easy, right? They've
Sure.
got a system in place now that really works, and they have a brand that's amazing and draws people there. So again, you'd want to know, if I spend this much money within 90 days, am I likely to get to break even within 90 days? Or is there a longer window of time? And you should build a pro forma which shows your expected ramp up in time. And then you need to build in a big margin of error. But just as an example, I had a client for many years that had a service-based concept, and they were very upfront with their franchisees. They would tell them that regardless of what item 7 of the franchise disclosure document says, you should expect to lose money after 90 days for at least a year and
Mm.
sometimes 2 years, because the concept required that you get a bunch of commercial customers, and you had to build that book of customers up until you had enough customers that you got to break even. Once you had the book of customers, you would just keep adding more customers, and now you were profitable, and it was a great business. People needed to understand that A, they might have to shovel some more money in after 90 days, and B, if they were expecting to be making a living out of the business in month 4, that was unrealistic. They had to have enough resources for their family to survive, whether that means money in the bank or whether that means that if you're married, one of the spouses has a good job and you can afford to live off of that. So people should understand that. And again, I highly recommend that if they don't have an accountant, that they get one, and that they enlist the aid of an accountant in figuring out how to create this pro forma and really take a hard look at what it's going to take financially to start the business. And lastly, those are great questions to ask existing franchisees.
Mm.
And the feedback I get from my clients is, if they talk to 10 existing franchisees, and I recommend you speak to at least 10, if there are 10, and they ask those franchisees if they'll share their profit and loss statements with my clients, surprisingly, many people will. They're very generous with their time and information. And I think there's sort of an affinity amongst business owners that makes people want to help other people in business. So oftentimes they will share that information. And I always say, there's a list of franchisees in the back of every FDD. You should be on the phone calling them. If they've had units that have gone out of business for whatever reason in the last year, you should be calling those people too and find out what happened. Sometimes they went out of business for reasons which had nothing to do with the franchise model. The
Sure.
people have personal issues that come up. They get a divorce. They have an illness in the family and they have to attend to that sick family member. Occasionally, somebody's really not suited to be in the business world and they bought a franchise and they probably shouldn't have. They just aren't well set to be a business owner. But you should also be asking that why question. And occasionally, people do dumb stuff, for lack of a better term. So, I always give the example some years back. I had helped a client. I reviewed the FDD for the client. He bought a restaurant concept. I didn't speak to him for several years. And then he called me out of the blue one day and he said, I'm wondering if I close my restaurant, will I owe the franchisor any damages for that? Because I'll be in breach of the franchise agreement. And I said, sure, I'm happy to look at the contract and let you know what I find. I'm curious, why are you wanting to close your restaurant? Are you losing money? He said, no, I made about $100,000 last year. And so I said, okay, then why do you want to close it? And sort of the short version is, I think he was a divorced guy in his 50s who'd met, I presume, a rather attractive woman, attractive to him at least, and she wanted to live at the beach. She didn't want to live in Atlanta. So he was going to do what she wanted him to do because it's hard for a divorced guy in the 50s to find an attractive woman in their 30s. So was that a good business decision? No, that's just not thinking straight. But frankly, men are known for that sometimes.
Every once in a while, yeah.
Yeah. I said to him, well, maybe you ought to sell it instead of closing it. And he's like, oh, wow, that's an interesting thought. And I introduced him to a broker and he sold it at a profit. And then he was able to get out of the business. Now, it took a little while I don't remember how long, 4 or 5 months, maybe,
Sure.
the business. But so anyhow, when you're looking at you're talking with franchisees, you just want to be asking a lot of questions. And again, what the feedback I get from clients is many franchisees that are in a system will be free with information. And then the other thing you should be doing when you're speaking with franchisees is if they're not free with information, you should be listening to what they're not saying. So what are they not telling you? Are you getting a good feeling about this? That requires a bit of intuition, I guess. But yeah, the more people you talk to, the more information you will have. If you were buying a car tomorrow, I would say a well-advised consumer would be reading up about that car, finding out if there were a lot of service issues with the car, how the car performed in the marketplace, those kinds of things. So why would this be any different? You're about to invest typically 6 figures or well up, into the high 6 figures or more. Why would you not be asking a ton of questions? Which isn't to say that they shouldn't do it. It's just to say, ask a lot of questions, right? Don't spend 2 hours on this like you were planning a vacation somewhere, right? This is oftentimes your family's life savings. So be careful with your dollars. And then also give yourself a better chance of success, because by asking questions of the franchisees, sometimes you can learn some things about what's worked for them and avoid some startup headaches by getting advice from people that have already been in that system.
Yo, thanks for listening this far. It's at this point in the episode that I want to talk about Streetwise franchising, teaching, training, building. Streetwise franchising. As a franchise consultant, it's my job, it's my absolute pleasure, and it's my mission to help aspiring entrepreneurs find, launch, and build their ideal business. I've been a franchise owner for almost a decade. I know what it means to struggle. I know what it means to build a team. If you're ready to get off of zero, if you're ready to build something for yourself, visit streetwisefranchising.com. Let's get the conversation started. Don't wait until tomorrow to build your future. It starts today. Streetwise franchising. Stay humble, stay hungry, stay streetwise. Let's get back to the episode. Yeah, I say it all the time, and it's so true. One of the best things about being in a franchise system is leveraging the experiences of other franchisees. And that is so true even before you get into the franchise. And it's the acknowledgement that when you're talking to a development rep that works for the franchisor, or you're dealing with these FSO organizations, franchise sales organizations, and you got to remember that their job is to sell franchise units, to sell franchise territories. So the way that they are going to speak to you is in a way that makes it sound really good. Most people, from what I found, don't do that extra effort that you're talking about. And so that responsibility goes back on them, the prospective franchisee, the person that wants to become a business owner and invest in this system and get all these tools. Oftentimes they think it's going to be a lot easier than it actually is. And when they get launched, they end up getting punched in the face and they realize, wow, I should have done more research. Or they were gritty enough and they were able to figure it out and they're able to make it work. Now, I want to flip it though. What is the legal responsibility on some of these organizations to make sure that they are setting the right expectation as franchisees or prospective franchisees are looking at opportunities? Where can it go wrong where they might cross the line, and what do people need to look out for there?
So, first of all, much of the information that one would want to see in evaluating a potential franchise purchase is supposed to be in your franchise disclosure document. In addition to the contract, you've got a wealth of information that the Federal Trade Commission requires be in that FDD. Typically, we've talked about item 6 and item 7, which has a lot of financial information. You're going to want to look at item 2, which has the background of the principals involved on the franchisor side, and see, are they new to this? Do they have a lot of background? I even suggest do the basics, right? If there's a list of 8 people that are principals or officers with the franchisor, Google them, right? Find out what you can find out about them. Have they had problems in the past? Hopefully not, but you want to know that. And my God, we are connected to this thing called the internet that gives us access to almost all the information on the planet. Let's use it, right? Then you want to look at item 3 to see if the company or its principals have been involved in litigation. I also suggest people take a hard look at items 19 and 20. Item 19 contains financial performance representations that the franchisor is making. By law, they're given a lot of latitude about how they make those. So sometimes you'll see just top-end revenue numbers by unit or by category. Sometimes you'll see more granular information. They may give you that top-end revenue information and some cost information for principal expense categories. So if it's a restaurant, those typically are going to be rent, labor, and food cost. But there are other expenses, but they might only give you those 3, or they might give you all the expenses. But take a good look at it and make sure you understand the business model. Again, that should tie in maybe to looking at item 7 and building your pro forma. Item 7 has your expenses, costs. Item 19 may help you figure out what kind of revenue can you expect. If the franchisor doesn't make an item 19 disclosure, and they're not required to by law, I always ask, why is that, right? If they have good numbers, why don't they put them in the document? They are not allowed to make financial performance representations. So that includes revenue numbers, cost numbers, anything having to do with the operational side, financial operational side of the business outside of that FDD, item 19. So if somebody working for the franchisor or a franchise sales representative gives you data outside of what's in that item 19, watch out, because that's not okay. Item 20 gives you a breakdown of units by state, showing where the units are and the number of units that have been in existence, that have closed, additionally, number of units that have opened over the last 3 years. So it can be a pretty good guideline. You can look at it and see, certainly if you're seeing a lot of failures, that's a red flag. And you need to ask, what went wrong, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that it's a problem. There are some franchises that are really, really dependent on the ability of the franchisee to get into the community and sell. And that's fine. But some people aren't well suited for that. And they may think that they are, but when they actually get out and do it, they may not be very good at it. Some people are great at it, right? And some people are naturals. And some people have the ability, but if they have the right coaching and training, they could do it well. But there's going to be a higher failure rate for those types of businesses typically than a business which relies on advertising to drive some kind of service or retail traffic. So we're back to Chick-fil-A. They don't, yeah, of course, they have tons of advertising, but I could open one tomorrow, and as long as it's well located, it's going to do just fine because everybody knows Chick-fil-A, and they have great product and they have great service. So, looking at item 20, you want to scrutinize that. What's the failure rate been? And I'll add a note of caution, which occasionally we see really, really fast-growing franchise systems, and that's reflected in item 20. So I'm thinking of a brand years ago that was very popular when eBay first came out, and it was called I Sold It on eBay. or something to that effect. And the idea was people were starting to use eBay, but they didn't want the headache of dealing with listing it themselves and having to ship it by taking their thing they were selling to the UPS store or FedEx. So you could just bring it to the I sold it on eBay store, and they'd sell it for you and they'd take a commission. And I may be wrong, but I think they sold about 700 of these franchises in a,
Oh,
in a,
wow.
in a 3-year window. I mean, enormous growth. Well, Google them now and see how many of them are left. I think it's a couple of handfuls of that. And I think the business model apparently didn't work as well as advertised, probably because it took more space to store and ship all the stuff that people were bringing in than the average small retail store that they had could handle. You had to sell a lot of stuff for people on the commission to earn enough money to pay your rent and your employees and the other expenses of operating the business. And it was really challenging to do that. So my example would be, I have 2 now adult daughters, but they both had bicycles. And at some point, if I wanted to sell them on eBay, I'd take them to the store. Well, bicycles take up a lot of room. And if you have a 2,000 square foot retail space, where are you going to store a bunch of bicycles to
Sure.
sell them? So, I'm not saying that high growth, super, super high growth is bad. I'm just saying don't take that as evidence by itself that this is a fantastic idea.
So let me ask you this. What you just said was interesting. What happens when a system as advertised doesn't work as well as it was advertised? And you have franchisees that they signed up for a thing. Now, I know the FDD is the FDD. Do the franchisees have any rights in getting out, in any sort of retribution? Is it something where they got to close shop and walk away? Like, what happens when the system doesn't work as well as it was advertised to them when they bought in?
That's going to be very fact specific, but
Okay.
I always start by telling people, and I get a lot of phone calls from people who are struggling as
I'm
franchisees,
sure you do.
and I'm
Yeah.
trying to help them. And one of the first things I tell them is, in most instances, the law does not impose what I call an obligation of competence on the part of the franchisor.
Interesting.
So you signed this contract, they've told you how wonderful they are,
Yep.
um, and they may or may not be. But if they're not, and they don't provide you with a lot of support or the support you were expecting, contractually, there's not typically a whole lot you can do about it. Because if you read the franchise agreement carefully, what it says is, I, the franchisor, will provide you with such support. I'll train you, and then I'll provide you with such support as I think you need to have. Well, Matthew, I thought I gave you the support you needed, and obviously you're not very good at running a business, so you failed. I'm sorry, but that's not my fault, right? It's your fault.
Sure. Yeah.
And that may be true, even though there are 50 other people like you in a system of 75 franchisees who are all failing. I would certainly take that as an indication that the franchisor didn't give them the tools they needed. So back to your question, one of the things to be watchful for in signing a franchise agreement is what obligations you as a franchisee have if you just close up shop, terminate. A lot of times the franchise agreement may say that you owe them liquidated damages, which is either a fixed amount or it's a formula which is based on the royalties and sometimes the ad fund fees times a period of time, like 2 or 3 years. I'm seeing more and more agreements where they say you have to pay us those amounts through the end of the franchise agreement term. So that's 10 years sometimes. I try to suggest to clients that they negotiate a cap on that going in so they at least know
Okay.
what they're risking, and can decide whether or not that's something they could deal with if the business doesn't work out. There are a number of states that have franchise registration laws, and many of those states will regulate how franchisors sell franchises, and also they give franchisees some additional rights that may be non-waivable. The law says it doesn't matter what the contract says. There's certain things that as a franchisee you get that are protections that the government's going to give to you. And if you're in one of those states, that can be helpful. Unfortunately, that's effectively probably a quarter of the U.S. population, I'm guessing. Maybe it's a third
Wow.
that's
Yeah.
covered by those statutes. And I'm not advocating for or against them. I'm just saying if you happen to be in one of those states, you may be in a better position to negotiate a better exit. Again, I think it's important going in to understand what's in your contract and be prepared to discuss it. It's a business and you can't be Pollyanna-ish about it. You need to know what you're committing to do. And you need to think about, as with any business, what happens if the worst happens to me?
Yeah.
What if I'm not successful? What if I'm losing money every month? And how am I going to deal with this? So it is a business risk that you're taking, and you need to be mindful of that. And then you asked about negotiating contract terms. Most larger systems, or even decent sized systems, won't negotiate anything at
Yeah.
all or very much, right? They might negotiate one or two really minor points. New systems sometimes will negotiate. But I also tell clients you need to be able to walk away if the contract isn't right for you, if you're not comfortable with it. So I'll give you an example of what I call a deal killer in my view, but it's not for me to decide. It's for my clients to decide.
Yeah.
Um,
100%.
I still occasionally see franchise agreements that have what's called a clawback right. And essentially it says that the franchisor can, on a given date, usually it's the 6th anniversary of signing the franchise agreement, they have the option to buy your business back from you, to buy it from you, usually at a multiple of earnings. So it's X times EBITDA. And it's usually a very generous sounding multiple of earnings, like 5 or 6. And most small businesses sell in the 2 to 4 times earnings range. So that
Sure.
sounds really generous. And then I point out to people, well, here's some things I really saw during the Great Recession. I had clients who called me in early 2011 and they're like, oh my gosh, I barely survived last year. My business was doing fine and then the recession hit and I made $12 last year. And thank goodness I made it through. Right? The economy is coming back. I'm going to be okay. But if the trigger date for exercising that right had been based on earnings in 2010, and the franchisee made $12 in 2010, at 6 times $12 would be
Wow.
$72, right? I can buy your business for $72. And then the franchisee says, but I've got $500,000 invested in this business and equipment and build out and startup costs. And the franchisor says, well, sorry. So, I've also seen situations where many of my clients are people in their 40s or 50s and even early 60s who are buying a franchise. And they're hoping at least that this will be the last thing they do in their working life. So if you bought a franchise when you were 55 and on your 60th birthday, the franchisor said, Matthew, we're exercising our right to repurchase it from you. Even if they gave you a fair number and it was not a bad deal, you might be sitting there saying, well, now what am I going to do? I'm 60 years old. It's harder
I
to
did
find
this,
a job
so
that
I
pays
didn't
well
have
at 60.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I think back to my father who lost his job when he was 58. It took him 15 months to find another good job. And he was really lucky that he did, but nobody wanted to hire him because he had gray hair. Actually, he didn't have a lot of hair at that point, but he was really lucky because he found a job because somebody was looking for someone who could communicate with and understand senior citizens. So they were looking at him and hired him because he didn't have a lot of hair. But
Sure.
my point is simply being put in a position where you can be forced to sell your business when you're not ready to may not be a great thing. So all I'm saying is when you're looking at the contract, you have to decide at some point, say, I'm going to look at something else, right? There are other concepts that make more sense for me, and they have a contract that works better for me. It's not a good or bad issue. It's an issue of what works for you, but you have to be prepared to walk away, right? You can't let yourself get caught up in the emotion of it. And sometimes you have to spend a lot of time to find the right concept for you. Don't be in a rush. Take your time. And then hopefully you'll find the right thing and it'll have the contractual terms that make sense for you.
You've given a lot of great advice on the investigation and what to look for, and I love being able to provide these types of stories to help people navigate the space. As a franchisee myself in multiple systems, and also as a franchise consultant, I get paid by helping people invest in franchise businesses, and I'd like to think that I can use my platform to help people choose wisely, but you just see people getting taken advantage of all the time. They get in these bad systems. Is there anything that they can do after they've already invested in a system? I mean, is it at that point, is it too late? You take the loss, you file bankruptcy, and then you just move on? Like what are some of these people supposed to do when they truly find themselves in tough situations? And for context, I love the opportunity in franchise ownership. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now
Sure.
if I didn't absolutely love what the opportunity provided for people. But I hate hearing stories about people who are struggling, and I just want to be able to provide them with some sort of hope or some sort of strategy in how to maneuver through some of the tougher times when maybe it is time to move on.
So a couple things. First of all, they should definitely consult an attorney,
Okay.
and don't wait until you. I mean, if you feel yourself, to use the analogy, getting sick, don't wait to go to the doctor until you're so bad they have to take you in an ambulance to the hospital. Right.
Mm,
If you see bad stuff happening, that's the time to seek professional advice, which could be an attorney, and or your accountant again, and figure it out. Sometimes there are things we can do to help people, and many franchisors are not unsympathetic, and they will negotiate a reasonable exit of some sort. The thing to remember is if your business is losing money and it's never made money, it's going to be nearly impossible to sell. And if the
yeah.
franchisor tells, well, we'll resell it for you, I am sorry. Why would you want to buy a bit? Why would anyone want to buy a business that has never made money and it's losing money, right? It's just not very attractive. But definitely consult professionals. And then the other thing I say to people is know when to quit.
Mm,
No one likes a quitter, right? We all want the guy or gal that fights through every situation. But understand at some point you may need to quit. And the sooner you set boundaries about, well, I'm going to do this for this much longer and see what happens, I think the better off you are. I have a now retired law partner who was a Marine captain before he went to law school.
okay.
And he jokingly told me about the first Marine rule of hole digging, which is, Marine, if you find yourself in a very, very deep hole, put the shovel down. And it's the same thing, right? Don't keep digging the hole, right? And maybe you need to quit while you still have some resources to restart your life, whatever that is, and be thoughtful to going in. So I love the idea of entrepreneurs who invest their life savings and make a go of something, right? And we all hear about people that didn't succeed at something till it was their third or fifth business try. I certainly admire people that have that kind of gumption and stick it to itness. But you have to have the resources and the willingness to do that and to do that to your family. And if you're starting a business that's a franchise, consider maybe you shouldn't invest every single penny you have in it. Maybe you should invest a reasonable sum based on your resources. And
Mm,
so just be mindful of those things
there
going
it
in
is.
so you don't find yourself at the bottom of the really deep hole still digging.
Oh, that's awesome, man. I appreciate that. I know to the listener that added a ton of value. Anything else that you think somebody, maybe it's something I didn't ask, maybe something I forgot. I know we covered a lot of good information, and I want to respect your time. Just as we wrap up, anything that you want to say to the franchisees, franchisors, prospective franchise owners that are listening?
Yes, one tip. And I think this is true both in terms of building a legal case if you ever have to, if you find yourself in a bad position, but also it's helpful in just in starting any business. And that is write it down. Whatever it is you're doing, when you're talking to the franchise sales organization's rep, take notes, have something you can refer back to as you're outlining your business. Write it down, right? Create this pro forma, know what you need to do, understand things, and be able to look back at this to the extent that you're having problems and you're having conversations with the franchisor. Write it down. Write down who you talked to and what they told you and when. And that's true in the sales process too. I had a friend who went on to be a judge here, and we were talking over cocktails at some point, and I asked him, he tried cases. Sometimes we think of jury trials, but judges try cases without juries frequently. And I asked him, how do you know who's telling the truth, right? You got one side saying one thing and one side saying the other thing. And he said, I look for the paper because
Mm,
paper doesn't usually lie. If somebody's got a string of emails to show what was said, that tells me a lot, right? And if those emails contradict what the other guy is saying, I'm going to believe the guy with the email. So write it down. Having contemporaneous notes helps. And if you ever have to see a lawyer, it helps. So, write it down both from a legal standpoint and from the standpoint of making good notes for yourself and understanding the structure of what you're doing so you can make a better decision. Don't keep it all in your head. I think I'm a reasonably intelligent person, but I'm just not that smart, right? I got to write it down.
there it is. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mike Rosenthal, thank you so much
Thank you for
for
having me
for
on the
coming
show,
on.
Matthew.
Yeah, this was really good. This is really good. Again, this platform is supposed to build the entire picture So it's not just pro franchising. Franchising is always amazing. Sometimes it's not, but some people, they only hear the negative and they never look for the positive. And so if I can bridge the gap here, bringing on individuals like yourself, I know you add a ton of value. So thank you to the listener. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share it with a friend, somebody who might find value. And as always, stay humble, stay hungry, stay streetwise. Peace. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for making it to the end. Hey, if this episode added any value to your life at all, please like it, share it, give me a 5-star review. It's the only way that this show is going to gain traction and help more people achieve their dreams. If you're ready to start your franchise journey, visit streetwisefranchising.com. Let's set up a time to talk. Hit me up on LinkedIn. Until next time, stay humble, stay hungry, stay streetwise. Peace.